7 weeks before the first neighbor scraped at her door, Mara Ellery had already made the decision everyone in Ash Hollow called foolish. Her wagon came down the settlement road, so slowly the horses looked as if they were dragging a house. The rear boards bowed. The wheels cut deep black ruts through thawing clay. On the wagon bed, tied beneath 2 ropes and an old quilt, sat a cast-iron base burner weighing nearly 230 pounds. People stepped out of the mercantile to watch it pass. A few stared at the stove. Most stared at Mara. She was 32, newly widowed, with a girl walking beside the left wheel, and a boy small enough to be frightened by the sound of the wagon groaning. A woman in her position was expected to travel light. Flour, blankets, a few pots, maybe a trunk if she was sentimental. Not iron, not a thing that took 4 men to lift and gave nothing back until winter tried to kill you. At the hitching rail, Silas Bragg gave a laugh sharp enough to turn heads. That woman will freeze before she finishes hauling the heater. Mara heard him. So did Ruth. So did little Ben. The wagon kept moving. The laughter stayed behind. And what nobody in Ash Hollow understood that afternoon was simple. Winter had not come yet, but it had already opened its books. Every habit in the valley was about to be measured. Every shortcut was about to be counted. And that black iron stove was not the burden they thought it was. It was Mara's first payment against the cold. Before Mara Ellery reached Ash Hollow, she had already given up almost everything that made a life feel like a life. Her husband, Daniel, died in late spring after a fever moved through the freight camps near the Dakota line. By the time the doctor arrived, there was nothing left to do except write down the date and close the door quietly. What Daniel left behind was not enough to comfort anyone. A rented room, a pair of children, 2 notes at the bank, a small claim he had marked months earlier in a windy fold of North Montana territory. The claim was not much to look at. A half-finished cabin leaned against a low rise above a creek that ran thin by August. The soil turned hard when it dried and sticky when it rained. The nearest neighbor was close enough to see smoke, but not close enough to hear crying. Still, land was land. If Mara could last 1 winter there, Ruth and Ben might someday own more than memory. That was why she sold the milk cow. That was why she left Daniel's walnut chest with a cousin. That was why she packed the children's school books in a crate and traded them for oats, lamp oil, and a coil of patched harness leather. But the stove stayed. People told her to sell it. A cast-iron base burner could bring real money in town, and money was easier to divide into useful things. Boots, meal, bacon, canvas, nails, medicine. A lighter sheet iron stove could be bought for less, and hauled without punishing the team. Mara listened to every argument. Then she tied the base burner to the wagon. The stove had belonged to Daniel's mother before it belonged to him. It was not beautiful. 1 foot had been replaced by a forged bracket. The mica window in the loading door was clouded brown from years of smoke. Inside the firebox, 1 brick had cracked from corner to corner, but it held heat like a stone holds noon. Daniel used to say a small stove was good for making a room cheerful. His mother used to answer that cheerful was not the same as alive. Mara remembered that. She remembered the mornings when a cheap box stove gave a family 3 bright hours, then left them shivering before dawn. She remembered the way cold found the floor first, then the blankets, then the children. A poor cabin did not need a prettier fire. It needed heat that could wait. That was the difference nobody laughed about in September. because September is generous. September lets people mistake comfort for judgment. Roads are still open. Wood can still be split. Doors still swing. A man standing in mild light can call a heavy stove foolish because the season has not yet asked him to prove anything. Mara did not try to explain. She had learned that some truths sound like nonsense until they become shelter. The road from the rail stop to Ash Hollow should have taken 1 day. With the stove aboard, it took nearly 2. Every rise slowed the horses. Every muddy stretch threatened a wheel. Mara walked most of the way, one hand on the wagon rail, watching how the load shifted over the back axle. When the team reached soft clay near the crossing, the right wheel sank almost to the hub. Ruth climbed down without being told. Ben followed, holding his sister's hand. Mara set a split cedar wedge against the wheel, loosened one rope, tightened another, then backed the horses half a step before asking them forward. The wagon groaned. The stove did not move. That mattered. A broken rope could crush a child. A sudden slip could lame a horse. A woman alone could survive embarrassment. She could not survive carelessness. By the time she entered Ash Hollow, the settlement had already gathered its opinion. Men near the hitching rail saw the bowed wagon and shook their heads. Storekeeper Agnes Vale watched from behind the mercantile window with a ledger in one hand. She did not laugh. She also did not come outside. Silas Bragg did. Silas hauled freight for half the valley. He knew what weight cost, what mud cost, what horses cost. He had made a life by counting burdens correctly. One look at the stove told him all he thought he needed to know. "You sell the cow and keep the iron," he called. "That is widow arithmetic." Some men smiled. One actually clapped. Mara pulled the team to a stop only long enough to check the rear pin. Ruth kept her eyes on the ground. Ben looked up at the men, then at his mother. Why are they mad at the stove? For the first time all afternoon, Mara's mouth almost moved toward a smile. "They are not mad at the stove," she said. "They are mad at not understanding it." Then she clicked her tongue to the horses, and the wagon crept on. The claim lay beyond a stand of willow and a field of dry bunchgrass. Mara reached it after sunset. The hardest part of the journey waited there on the wagon bed. No neighbor came. No one from town followed. The stove sat above her like a black animal too stubborn to die. Mara did not have 4 men, but she had Daniel's block and tackle, 2 cottonwood skids, a length of chain, 3 wedges, and a habit of thinking before touching anything heavy. She lashed a pole between 2 old corral posts left by the previous claimant and hung the pulley from it. Ruth held the lantern. Ben's job was to count the pulls aloud so Mara would not hurry. 1. The stove shifted an inch. 2. The rope tightened until it sang. 3. The wagon board complained. Mara stopped often. She reset wedges. She checked the angle. She made the children stand behind a chalk line she scratched in the dirt with the heel of her boot. It was not really chalk. It was pale clay. But a line is useful when people agree to obey it. Near dark, the rope jumped in the pulley. The stove lurched toward the wagon edge. Ruth gasped. Ben stopped counting. Mara drove a wedge under the low corner with a crack that echoed across the yard. Then she wrapped the chain once around the stove leg and stood still, breathing through the pain in her scraped knuckles. The problem was not strength. It was direction. She changed the pull so the load moved sideways before it moved down. The weight stopped fighting her all at once. Inch by inch, the iron slid onto the skids. When it finally touched earth, the sky was black. The stove remained outside all night, waiting by the cabin door. Frost silvered its top before morning. In the gray light, it looked less like cargo than a test. The next visitor was not Silas Bragg. It was Otto Klein, a German blacksmith, who repaired hinges, plows, stove collars, and almost anything else people broke by trusting it too long. He rode out before noon because the story of Mara Ellery and her iron monster had traveled faster than her wagon. Otto did not laugh. Metal had taught him caution. He walked around the stove once. Then again. He crouched, peered into the firebox, touched the cracked lining, and looked toward the cabin wall. "Big body," he said. Small room. Mara was unpacking a sack of flour into a tin bin. Yes, base burner wants a steady draft. Bad pipe, loose door, wrong hearth, it will smoke and waste fuel. Heavy iron is not magic. No. Otto looked at her then. Most people defended their purchases. Mara did not. He tapped the firebox door. "Seal is poor. I need rope. Stove rope, if you have scraps." He narrowed his eyes. "Scraps will be ugly." Mara glanced at the unpainted cabin, the patched quilt over the doorway, the children sorting kindling from sticks. Ugly is not the danger. That was the first moment Otto stopped treating her as a woman attached to a bad decision. He looked again at the stove, then at the wall, then at the clay bank near the creek. "What are you planning behind it?" "Stone. Clay slip, space for air, not against the logs." Otto did not praise her. Men like him rarely praised until a thing had worked. But he went back to his horse and returned with a coil of blackened stove rope, half a collar, and 2 firebrick pieces that had survived another stove's failure. "Fit it tight," he said, "then test it before snow." Mara took the scraps. I was going to. Moving the stove into the cabin took most of 2 days. Outside, weight had been a distance problem. Inside, weight became a matter of inches. Mara removed the door from its hinges. She laid sackcloth across the plank floor. She set smooth river stones under the skids, so the iron could roll forward without tearing boards loose. Ruth learned to watch the stove's shadow against the wall to see when it tilted. Ben carried small stones and placed them where Mara pointed. Nothing about the work looked heroic. It looked slow. Pull, set, breathe, measure, pull again. By the second evening, the stove stood in the northeast corner, far enough from the logs to let air move behind it. Mara built a backing of flat creek stones and clay, not pretty, but thick enough to take heat without scorching the wall. The hearth rose above the floorboards, so ash could not settle into cracks. She set the pipe high enough to draw, and tight enough that smoke had only one honest path. Every choice stole time from something else. There was still chinking to finish. Still hay to stack. Still flour to ration. Still a door to hang properly. But Mara kept returning to the stove corner, as if she were building a second, smaller house inside the first. Ruth noticed. Children often see the shape of wisdom before they know its name. Ben placed both hands on the cold iron and frowned. "It does not feel warm." Mara wiped clay from her wrist. "Not yet. Will it keep us warm all night?" She did not say yes. A lie would have been easier and less useful. "If we do our work before night," she said, "it will do its work after." By mid-October, Mara counted her fuel and did not like the number. 1 cord, a little more than half another, and several piles of scrap too small to dignify with a name. A safer winter would have meant 2 cords and more if she could get it. But money had gone into pipe flour, oats, and the terrible business of arriving somewhere with nothing extra. She could not buy a shorter winter, so she bought efficiency with labor. Cottonwood went into one stack because it caught fast. Ash went into another because it burned slower and held a coal bed. Twigs and shavings stayed in a reach box, so Ruth could feed a new flame without holding the stove door open. Damp pieces were moved to the wall rack above the hearth, where they could dry before being kneaded. Then Mara did what made Silas laugh a second time. She built an indoor wood bay. It took up space the cabin did not have. A crib of rough boards stood within arm's reach of the stove, large enough to hold a full day's fuel and more if stacked carefully. Most families kept wood outside and brought in what they needed. That was sensible when a door opened easily, when tools were free, when weather remained weather and not a lock. Silas rode past one afternoon and saw Ruth carrying Ash splits through the door. "Keep that much wood inside," he called from the road, "and you will be feeding mice before you feed children." Mara did not answer. Silence was beginning to trouble him more than argument would have. Inside, Ruth stacked the wood exactly as her mother showed her. Heavy pieces to the back, quick pieces forward, bark side down when damp. Ben sat cross-legged and sorted shavings into a box. "Why not leave it outside?" Ruth asked when Silas was gone. Mara set one ash split across two others, because owning a thing is not the same as being able to reach it. Ruth looked toward the door. The idea was small enough to fit in her hand and large enough to change a winter. At the end of October, Mara performed the test Otto had advised. The night was cold, but not dangerous. That was why it was useful. She built the fire at dusk and let the base burner wake slowly. Cast iron did not hurry. Heat moved into it like water filling a deep well. The stone backing warmed after an hour. The pipe drew clean. The stove gave off a steadier warmth than the thin stoves Ruth remembered from the rented room. By bedtime, the cabin felt almost safe. Almost. Near 3 in the morning, Mara opened her eyes. No bang, no cry, only the feeling that the room had changed. She slid from bed and crossed the floor in wool socks. The stove still held heat. The coal bed still glowed beneath gray ash. But Ben's corner of the room was cooler. Not freezing. Not yet. Just wrong. Mara crouched near the hearth and held the back of her hand close to the floor. There it was. A thread of cold. It slid under the hearthstones where clay had pulled away from plank. Another sign showed near the pipe collar, a faint soot shadow no wider than a finger. Otto had been right. A heavy stove could not save a careless installation. Heat was not loyal to a family. It escaped wherever it was invited. Mara did not curse the stove. She thanked the night for telling her early. At dawn, she mixed clay slip with ash and worked it into every seam along the hearth. She packed the firebox door with Otto's rope scraps. She reset 2 stones behind the stove and hung a small sheet of tin at an angle to push radiant warmth back into the room. None of the repairs looked impressive. Most useful things do not. By afternoon, the cabin seemed unchanged, but the room had lost a leak. 2 days later, Otto returned. He stepped inside without much ceremony and noticed all of it. The packed rope, the dry clay, the clean pipe collar, the tin reflector. He pulled a cotton thread from his coat pocket and tied it near the hearth seam. The thread hung almost still. He waited. Mara waited. At last he nodded. Better. Better then. Otto looked through the small window toward the claims scattered across the hollow. Smoke rose from thin pipes. Wood piles leaned against cabin walls. Families moved through chores with the confidence of people repeating what had worked last year. Better than most, he said. It was not flattery. It was evidence that was worth more. Through November, Ash Hollow prepared for winter by counting visible things. Wood piles grew beside cabins. Men bragged about cords. Fresh-cut cottonwood stood in pale stacks against walls and sheds. Axes were sharpened. Flour was purchased. Doors were patched with whatever cloth or hide could be spared. Almost nobody bought stove rope. Almost nobody checked the collars. Almost nobody tested an overnight burn before weather made failure expensive. Habit is a powerful foreman, gives orders in the voice of experience. Around Ash Hollow, habit said a bright fire in a box stove had carried families before, so it would carry them again. It said more wood outside meant more safety inside. It said a widow's heavy stove was still an extravagance, even if Otto Klein no longer laughed. Mara watched and said little. She had no wish to win an argument in autumn. Autumn arguments are cheap. Winter answers are not. In the final week of November, the hollow changed before the sky did. Smoke from chimneys stopped rising straight and began to crawl low over the ground. Hoarfrost collected on fence wire before dusk. Horses turned their backs to the north and stood as if listening to a sound beyond human hearing. Mara noticed the creek first. Thin ice formed along the edge, not in sheets, but in hard, clear teeth. She broke one with her boot and saw how glassy it was. Not snow weather, not ordinary cold. Something wetter, something meaner. That evening, she filled the indoor bay until wood rose above the top rail. Ruth brought in 2 more loads after that. Ben carried kindling until his arms ached. Mara checked the door latch, the pipe, the water bucket, the lamp, the ash shovel, and the place where the hearth met the floor. Ruth watched her mother touch each part of the room. "Is it coming tonight?" Mara listened to the silence outside. "I think it has already started deciding." The storm arrived after midnight with no thunder and no wind worth naming. It came as fine, freezing rain. The sound on the roof was delicate at first. Needle taps. Then more of them. 1,000 tiny decisions hardening at once. Each drop struck a world already below freezing and turned to clear ice. It coated fence wire. It sealed handles. It glazed wagon wheels. It wrapped axe heads to their blocks and glued doors to their frames. By dawn, Ash Hollow shone like it had been dipped in glass. The ice was not deep like snow. That made it worse. Snow announces itself. Snow can be shoveled, drifted through, kicked aside. Ice disguises possession as availability. The wood piles were still visible. So were the tools. So were the doors. But winter had put a transparent lock on all of them. The temperature fell below 25 degrees under zero by mid-morning. The wind remained nearly absent. That silence made men slow to understand the danger. There was no white wall, no roaring blizzard, no dramatic sign that the valley had lost control. People stepped out to fetch what they owned and discovered ownership had become a rumor. At Silas Bragg's cabin, the morning began with confidence. His sheet iron stove roared before breakfast. The room warmed fast. His wife wrapped the children in quilts and told them the weather would break by noon. Silas had a large wood pile under the north wall. He had split most of it himself. He had even bragged about it at the mercantile. By 11, the indoor basket was empty. The box stove wanted more. Silas forced the door open and lost a wall of warm air doing it. Outside, his wood pile stood exactly where he had left it. It looked abundant. It looked ready. Then he drove the axe into it, and the blade bounced. The stack had frozen into one body. He swung again. Ice cracked, but no log came free. On the third swing, the axe handle split near the head. Silas stood there, breathing hard, staring at a winter's fuel he could see but could not use. Inside, the stove began cooling almost immediately. Thin iron gives heat quickly and surrenders it quickly. By early afternoon, the room had changed. Water in the basin filmed over. The children stopped arguing and drew closer to their mother. Silas tried to pry loose wood with a shovel. The shovel bent. Across the hollow, one chimney continued sending up a narrow ribbon of smoke. Mara Ellery's. Silas looked at it for a long time. For once, he did not laugh. Inside Mara's cabin, the storm found less to take. The room was not comfortable in the way a person dreams of comfort. It was better than that. It was steady. Before dawn, Mara fed cottonwood to the coal bed and let the flame return without flinging the damper wide. When the stove settled, she added ash splits and banked them under a clean layer of coals. The stone backing behind the stove warmed slowly. The clay seams held. The pipe drew without coughing smoke into the room. The tin sheet reflected heat toward the children's corner where the first test had failed. Ruth woke and did not hide beneath the blanket. Ben sat up, touched his own face, and grinned. "My nose is not biting me." Mara put a finger to her lips, but she smiled. At noon, she opened the stove door for less than 10 seconds. At 2, she turned the damper a finger width. At 4, she added 2 heavy pieces from the indoor bay and closed the door with both hands until the latch seated tight against the rope. It was not magic. That was the point. It was work done before work became dangerous. By late afternoon, the first knock came. Not strong, not proud. A dull scrape, followed by another. Ruth looked toward the door. Mara had already expected it. She had watched Silas's chimney thin, then stop. She had seen no smoke from the pike place beyond the draw. She had seen Lottie Graves's door remain shut too long for a woman with goats to feed. When Mara opened the door, Silas Bragg stood on the step with frost in his beard and shame on his face. Behind him, his wife held a child under a quilt. Farther back, Amos Pike came across the ice on hands and knees, dragging his youngest on a feed sack. Lottie Graves stood near the gate with a jar of preserves clutched under her shawl, as if payment made need easier to carry. For one breath, the road outside the mercantile returned. Silas laughing. Men smiling. Ben asking why they were mad at the stove. Mara felt all of it. Then she stepped aside. Get in before the cold finishes asking. No one apologized. The storm had stripped language down to useful things. People crossed the threshold in awkward order. Boots slipped. Quilts brushed the doorframe. A child began to cry and then stopped when warm air touched his cheek. The cabin they entered did not look rich. It had no parlor, no fine rugs, no spare bed, no polished table. What it had was order, wood within reach, kindling sorted, ash shovel near the hearth, water away from the draught, children kept from the door, a stone wall holding heat behind the black iron stove. The base burner sat in its corner without ceremony. It did not roar. It endured. That unsettled Silas more than spectacle would have. His own stove had been all flame and noise until it became nothing. Mara's showed a red bed of coals beneath ash, quiet as banked money. Otto arrived after dark, helping an older couple between him and their son. The first thing he did inside the cabin was look at the cotton thread near the hearth. It barely moved. The repair had held. He gave Mara one short nod. She returned it. That was the whole conversation. All night, 11 people shared the room in shifts. Children slept near the wall. Adults sat shoulder to shoulder on trunks, stools, and folded blankets. No one had enough space. Everyone had enough heat. At 6:30, Mara added ash. Near midnight, she banked the coals. A little after 3, she rose again, opened the door just long enough to feed the fire, and shut it before the room could lose what it had kept. Silas watched from the floor. He watched how she waited for the flame to take before adjusting the damper. He watched how Ruth handed kindling without being asked. He watched how Ben knew where the ash shovel belonged. He watched the stone backing give warmth back after the flame had lowered. The stove had never been the whole secret. That was the humiliation of it. He had laughed at iron because iron was what he could see. Mara had been building a system around it for weeks. Location, draft, seals, fuel order, indoor access, coal banking, children trained out of the danger zone, a room taught to keep what little heat it was given. Silas had counted cords. Mara had counted losses, and Winter had audited both accounts. The ice held for 36 hours. When it began to release, it did so by small sounds first. A fence wire snapped free with a bright twang. A cottonwood branch shed its casing and dropped a shower of glitter into the yard. Water began ticking from the lean-to roof in uneven beats. By afternoon, doors opened without a fight. Axe blades entered wood again. Smoke rose from chimneys that had gone dead the day before. Families left Mara's cabin quietly. Silas was the last of the men to go. He stood near the door with his hat in both hands. Words moved behind his eyes and failed to arrange themselves properly. Mara spared him the trouble. "Mind your pipe collar before the next cold," she said. He looked toward the stove, then toward the wood bay, then at Ruth and Ben, who were sweeping bark from the floor as if nothing important had happened. "I will," he said. 2 mornings later, Mara stepped outside to break ice from the water trough and found a fresh stack of split ash beside the lean-to. Not scraps. Not apology wood. Good pieces, cut to length and stacked high enough to matter. No note, no signature, only runner marks in the snow, turning toward Silas Bragg's place before they disappeared in the hard crust. Mara stood there for a while. Then she went back inside and put breakfast on. Spring did not change Ash Hollow all at once. Communities rarely learn by admitting they were wrong. They learn by doing the next thing differently and pretending it was always common sense. Agnes Vale's ledger began to show new purchases: stove rope, pipe collars, fire brick, sheet tin, better dampers, orders for 2 cast iron heaters that nobody called foolish after money changed hands. Otto Klein found himself invited into cabins before smoke leaked, not after. Men began covering wood stacks instead of admiring them. More houses built small indoor bays. Mothers taught children which pieces caught and which pieces lasted. Not every family bought a heavy stove. Mara never said they should. A big stove in a bad corner was only a heavy mistake. A smaller stove, fitted tight and fed wisely, could serve a careful house better than iron placed by pride. That became the lesson Ruth carried. Years later, when she married and moved to a claim of her own, Mara gave her a coil of clean stove rope wrapped in cloth. It was not a romantic gift. It was better. Ruth laughed when she opened it, then cried before she could stop herself. Mara touched her daughter's hand and said, "Do not start by asking how much heat you can make. Start by asking where it will leave." Ben learned the lesson differently. He grew into a man who built his own cabin with the hearth set before the shelves, the pipe checked before the trim, and a wood bay finished before he put glass in the second window. His stove was smaller than his mother's. His habits were not. The base burner stayed in Mara's cabin for 19 winters. Its black sides grew duller. The forged foot rusted at the edge. The mica window went nearly opaque. Children who had once warmed their hands against it became adults who stood before it with their own children. After a while, nobody thought of the stove as something Mara had hauled. It seemed to belong to the cabin the way a door belongs, the way a threshold belongs, the way a scar belongs to a hand that has kept working. The stove did not make Mara Ellery wise. It revealed that she had been wise before anyone had a reason to notice. That was the part Ash Hollow remembered least clearly, because people prefer a story where a thing saves a woman. The truth was sharper. A woman saved the heat. She saw winter not as weather, but as an auditor. She understood that cold does not care what a family owns. It cares what a family can reach, what a room can keep, what a tool can do after the flame has stopped showing off. 7 weeks before the ice storm, Mara dragged a decision through mud while the settlement laughed. When winter finally opened the ledger, it found the stove waiting. More importantly, it found the woman ready.